Hello, everyone, and thanks once again for joining us for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first, very strong winds with a strong low-pressure area moving northward towards St. Lawrence Island today, and that brought strong wind gusts to much of the west coast areas from the Alaska Peninsula. Shaktoolik River had the strongest legitimate wind gust I could find, 88 miles per hour, followed by Port Hayden, farther to the south there in the Alaska Peninsula with 86 miles per hour. Then back to the north, Cape Newnan had a peak wind gust of 83 miles per hour, and then the Alaska Peninsula again, southwest there of Port Hayden, Nelson Lagoon, 82 miles per hour. And winds at Donlin peaked at 73 miles per hour. Cape Bermonzoff, 71 miles per hour. Both Cold Bay and Platinum had wind gusts just under 70 miles per hour. And Kipnuk and Naknek, 67 miles per hour. So quite a windy day out west there with much lighter winds over the interior and winds coming down over the southeast coast. On the hazardous weather graphic, winter storm warnings continue for the Yukon Delta, lower Yukon Valley, lower Kobuk Valley, and all of the Kobuk Valley, up to Ambler, as well as much of the Seward Peninsula, northwest coast, Kotzebue, Selawik, Kivlina, up to Point Hope, and in the Noatak Valley, all continuing the winter storm warnings for tonight into Tuesday for snow, blowing snow, gusty winds, and visibilities to a quarter mile and less, and blowing snow. St. Lawrence Island, the Bering Strait coast, that's a advisory for high surf advisory for tonight and Tuesday, and also on the western central Arctic coast, high surf advisory there for tonight and Tuesday, especially tomorrow into tomorrow night, and then for the eastern North Slope, eastern and southeastern Brooks Range there, Arctic Village and those areas in the yellow shaded area there. Winter weather advisory out late tonight through tomorrow night, and then a high wind warning out for the Alaska Range for tonight through tomorrow night for winds gusting as high as 70 to 75 miles per hour. On the satellite here, you can see clear skies over the Panhandle as clouds increase over the remainder of interior Alaska from the North Gulf Coast right up to the Arctic coast. Mostly hidden high and mid-level clouds over the eastern part of the state, and then the precipitation-producing clouds back to the west. Now coming into southern and western Cook Inlet, both Seldovia, Homer carrying some light rain, and half-mile in moderate snow at Kenai, at least for a time this afternoon. And Kodiak Island into the rain now, and the strong winds there on the back, just in advance of that front, starting to come down now with the front pushing inland and the low center pushing up to the north. And then another band of cold air coming in, bringing rain and snow showers into Chimay-Anat-2, and some showers over the central Aleutians today. But you can see the northward movement and also shifting eastward, the whole pattern shifting eastward as high pressure aloft breaks down and shifts off to the southeast over the Panhandle late this afternoon and tonight. That's going to really continue to lighten the winds up there. And then as the high continues to break down, eventually some moisture will even work into the southeast coast over the next couple of days. Otherwise, rain, Kodiak Island, and the increasing winds. You can see the gradient there over the western and southwest interior. Kotzebue seeing wind gusts up to 55 miles per hour today, and blowing snow, Seward Peninsula, anywhere from 4 to 6 inches at Nome, and up to let's see, 3/4 of an inch of rain falling at, I believe, Togiak. And wet conditions over the Alaska Peninsula, changing to showers and starting to end over the western Alaska Peninsula, but then breezy conditions over the southern Bering Sea and the western Aleutians, and the gradient starting to slacken off there over the Panhandle, but another clear, cold day down in that area with lighter winds. And for tonight, that front pushes eastward, starts to weaken a little bit. Look for gusty southeast winds to increase over the mountainous terrain of south central Alaska, Chugach Mountains, Turnagain Arm, but it doesn't look like it'll be all that strong, but definitely bringing some warmer air in. Portage carrying light rain now, and I think, Bird Point there in Turnagain Arms. So there is warmer air aloft definitely coming in. Mixed rain and snow across the Kenai Peninsula, mostly along the North Gulf Coast. Upslope areas of the Alaska Range seeing mostly snow and blowing snow heaviest there over the lower Yukon River, Seward Peninsula, up into the northwest interior, the Kobuk Valley, and some snow even reaching the eastern Arctic coast. And windy conditions with rain and showers for the southern Bering Sea, Aleutians pushing into the Alaska Peninsula. Another weak low keeps it wet over Kodiak Island. Forecast for tomorrow, light winds for the Panhandle with increasing clouds and a chance of some light rain or snow on the north coast, as well as over toward the eastern areas and then down toward Dixon Entrance. So definitely a turnaround in the weather there, with a high pressure shifting off into southern British Columbia. And that front keeps it wet over Kodiak Island, but not much in the way of wind with that weak system, that 1,002 millibar low near the Alaska Peninsula. Areas of light snow over the western interior. Snow and blowing snow continue, especially from Kotzebue Sound up across the northwest interior to the western Arctic coast. And then for the day on Wednesday, areas of light snow or snow showers over much of interior Alaska, kind of tapering off over toward the east and ending, say, around Eagle and those areas. And wind and rain on the increase for the coastal areas of the Panhandle, maybe some mixed precipitation pushing inland there, possibly to Juneau, maybe up to Haines, but at least through the afternoon, if that occurs, it'll be quite light. And the next big storm pushing into just southwest of the western Aleutians. Lows tonight, mid-teens to mid-20s for the Panhandle near zero Copper River Basin, 20s to mid-30s elsewhere. And then highs tomorrow, mid-40s Kodiak Island, near 40 for Bristol Bay. And a big jump into the 30s. South Central Alaska, lower 40s for Homer, lower 20s for the Copper River Basin, and in the 30s for the Panhandle, followed by lows, mostly in the upper teens, lower 20s for the southeast coast, teens for Copper River Basin, otherwise 20s to mid-30s elsewhere, and then the highs in the mid-20s for the Copper River Basin, near 30 for the Kuskokwim Valley, and in the 30s South Central Alaska, mid-40s Kodiak Island. Lows up to the north there tonight, much milder, continuing, but still a little below zero there up over the northeast interior down to Northway, near 20 for the western Arctic coast, followed by highs Tuesday afternoon, 20s on the Arctic coast. Single numbers northeast interior or the eastern interior, and then mid to upper 30s for the Seward Peninsula area, St. Lawrence Island. Lows now back above zero, but still single numbers in the east and 20s in the west. And highs not much warmer there in the east, and then upper 20s to near 30 in the west, a little shade above freezing St. Lawrence Island. And out to the southwest, lows tonight, lower 30s along the coast into Bristol Bay, upper 30s to near 40 for the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians. And highs tomorrow, lower 40s for the Pribilofs, lower to mid 40s for the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. And Wednesday morning lows in the lower 30s, southwest coast, followed by highs mostly in the 40s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, high pressure moving out off to the southeast. So we've got VFR now, Yakutat in the southeast coast. Otherwise, a lot more in the way of marginal VFR and IFR, with the heaviest IFR, the most extensive area over the southeast Bering Sea into the southwest interior, and extending in areas up to the north all the way to the central Arctic coast. And then the central western Bering Sea, VFR, including the Aleutians. And for the afternoon, improving over the eastern interior, but some IFR lingering over the Yukon Flats. Marginal VFR along and south of the Brooks Range, Kobuk, Koyukuk Valley areas, but north of the Brooks Range, VFR all the way out to the Arctic coast, IFR for the DeLong Mountains to Point Hope and Cape Lisburne, possibly to Kivlina, southern Seward Peninsula, Teller areas, Norton Bay, Norton Sound, all of the southwest interior. In fact, IFR to the western Alaska Range across the Kuskokwim Valley and southwest coast, Alaska Peninsula, VFR, eastern Aleutians, westward, and marginal VFR south of the Alaska Range, including the Copper River Basin, and that now pushing into Yakutat and the north coast of the Panhandle. Otherwise, the remainder of the southeast coast remaining in VFR. And for Wednesday morning, got IFR pushing northeastward all the way up to the southern slopes of the central and western Brooks Range, and again some IFR over the Yukon Flats, but north of the mountains up there, VFR right out to the Arctic Ocean. And still some IFR possibly clipping Point Hope and Cape Lisburne, northern Bering Sea, St. Lawrence Island to the Bering Strait, Norton Sound, Yukon Kuskokwim Delta and the Kuskokwim Valley, all IFR right up into the about to Tanana, and then marginal VFR there for eastern interior. Looks like the Nenana Fairbanks area. Pretty good. VFR Northern Cook Inlet and the southern Susitna Valley, Turnagain, Knik Arms. And for the Wednesday afternoon time frame, marginal VFR, Northern Panhandle VFR to the south. VFR holds there. Turnagain, Knik Arms, Northern Cook Inlet, Anchorage, Palmer, maybe up to Talkeetna, and also in the mid and upper Tanana Valley, most of the 40-mile country VFR. IFR, Norton Sound, Yukon Kuskokwim Delta, IFR along the Aleutians, southern Bering Sea, but the Perbolos VFR that extends eastward to Kodiak Island. Anatuvik, marginal VFR for the day on Tuesday. Same thing for Adigan, occasionally marginal. Lake Clark and Merrill, IFR. Rainy, IFR. Windy, marginal VFR. Keep it marginal for Isabel as well. And Mintesta, VFR, trending toward marginal VFR, especially on the southern entrance. They're kind of bouncing back and forth there. And for Tanita, marginal VFR. Portage also looking marginal tomorrow on either entrance. Chilkoot and White, one more VFR day coming up. And for the freezing levels, retreating back to the north now, moving up to northern Cook Inlet, north of Bristol Bay, 4,000 to 6,000 feet over Kodiak Island. And icing above about 6,000 feet, give or take. Areas of isolated moderate rime icing covering much of interior Alaska into the northern panhandle, back across Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula. Just a slight elevated threat there for the eastern Aleutians, and that becomes a little more widespread up towards St. Lawrence Island and the Seward Peninsula area. And for the winds aloft jet stream level, about 33,000 feet, 155 knot west-northwest winds south of Shumianatu. Otherwise, the northerly jet now with the ridge kind of shifting off to the southeast is going with it. So you can see 110 knots there across Vancouver Island. Otherwise, milder southwest flow, 75 knots over much of interior Alaska. 9,000 feet. Southwest, 50 to 70 knots there across the Seward Peninsula up into the western Brooks Range area. Lighter there, much lighter over the southeast interior and the Gulf of Alaska. And at 3,000 feet, southwest 40 to 50 knots with that low over the Chukchi Sea. East-southeast 60 knots right across Kamishak Bay and Iliamna Lake area. And pretty light for the Panhandle and the eastern and southeast interior. Westerlies 45 to 55 knots over the southern Bering Sea and the Aleutians. Aleutians, considerable moderate chop that extends into the Alaska Peninsula. Also, Kenai Peninsula, Barren Islands, western Alaska Range, Kuskokwim Valley, moderate chop, and the northwest interior, as well as St. Lawrence Island. And after the break, I'll be back with a look at the marine forecasts.
Welcome to this edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Carrie Haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. With me today, I have Dr. Doug Wesley, a physical scientist for the National Weather Service Alaska Region Headquarters. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Carrie. Hello.
Hello. So you're here to talk to us a little bit about something called CocoRAS, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And I understand that CocoRAS is a network of volunteers who take weather observations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what CocoRAS is?
Yes, it began in the lower 48, 20 some years ago, and it's expanded during those 2 decades. They're getting something like 10 to 15,000 rainfall reports per day from the lower 48.
Wow, that's a lot of different reports. So how many reports do we get in Alaska right now?
Well, it varies. maybe 10 to 25. But if you consider the large areas we're talking about, we have a lot of gaps to fill. Any observation is better than no observation, but there are large areas in Alaska. Alaska covers 3 million square miles. There's a lot of data gaps in that space, so we'd like to enhance it.
Sure. So tell us then a bit about why these observations are so important to Alaska and why we need to expand the number of them that we're getting.
Yes, Alaska, as you know, has large areas with a lot of complex terrain, and there are no weather observing stations or radar. So CoCoRaHS can help fill the data gaps, so you can at least get some idea of what's actually falling from the sky at those locations. CoCoRaHS increases the amount of timely weather observations available to meteorologists and other decision makers, especially in hazardous type of weather, both rain and snow and the occasional hailstorm that we get up here. CoCoRaHS observations can help forecasters identify long-term precipitation and snowfall trends in a climate sense. And just overall, they increase the amount of timely weather observations available to the public.
So then let's talk a little bit about each of the different types of observations. So it's the rain, hail, and snow network. So let's start by talking a little bit about rain observations, and tell us a little bit about how you take those and how long it takes a volunteer to get a rain observation.
Okay, this is a 4-inch gauge, just the basic gauge, which you use for both rain and snowfall. But the rain observations are pretty quick. It's a matter of 2 to 3 minutes that each volunteer goes out and takes a reading, and then they enter these on the computer, and they're immediately available for observation on the computer and on the maps, so that you can see your report. In the wintertime, it's a little bit more complicated. We require the observers to measure not only the snow accumulation, but also liquid equivalent. So they've got to melt the snowfall. This involves 2 of these gauges and a snowboard. And it's maybe a 10-minute observation per day during the winter. But the snowfall is so variable that even across town and in especially the remote areas, it's crucial that we increase this number of snow observations in the network.
Right. I understand that we can only take observations in places where we have weather service offices, and so we rely on all of these volunteers to help us fill gaps. And it's also interesting to know how snowfall varies across large spaces or even small cities. So I noticed here in Anchorage, for example, we can have a vastly different amount of snow on the east side of town and the west side of town. And so it seems like these observations would help us to better understand what's going on in places besides just where the office is.
That's correct. In any given snowfall, there are typically large variances, as you know, and we rely on reports from the public and from National Weather Service cooperative spotters to map out the snowfall that occurs so that we can predict it better in the future.
Sure. So we talked about rain observations and we talked about snow observations, and you said for each of those, if it's rain, it only takes a couple minutes, and then it can take about 10 minutes if it's snow. Hail was the other one that we didn't talk about yet. Tell us just a little bit about the hail observations that CoCoRaHS observers take.
Yeah, the CoCoRaHS network, it has a hail pad, and it's just a simple block of styrofoam covered with aluminum foil, and you can approximate the size of hail by measuring the dent that the hail causes on the pad, and this can give us an estimate of hail size. We don't get hail very often in Alaska, but I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my 5 years in Anchorage, and some of it up to a ½ inch, and I'm sure there's been larger hail up in the interior at times.
So let's talk a little bit about how these rain, hail, and snow observations can help forecasters. So we have people who forecast the weather, and we also have people who work on the hydrology side, and I can see that maybe CoCoRaHS will be beneficial to both of them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it's beneficial to the hydrologic forecaster who's concerned about flooding, and a rainfall comprises one of the causes of a flood, or it can exacerbate high water conditions. So the more the hydrologist has to look at in terms of data from recent rainfall, the more information they have to work work with when they're generating forecast. The weather forecasters in the wintertime at the Weather Service office can use these observations also to help with past case studies, to verify model data, and to get a handle on what's actually happening out the window. And that's important in the forecast process.
Yeah, it seems like you can never have too much information when you're issuing a forecast. So it only takes a few minutes most of the time to take these observations. So let's say I'm interested in becoming a volunteer for CocoRa's. How do I get involved?
Yeah, the website is very useful, cocoras.org, and it has a number of video-based training tutorials that take you right on from measuring rainfall to a video tutorial on measuring snowfall. It has the maps available in real time, and you can go back and look at that old data too through those maps. And so it's a very useful, comprehensive website.
Very interesting. And anybody can get involved, right? You don't have to be a meteorologist.
That's right. And, we love to have once a day reports throughout the year, but if you can't, then so be it. And we have observers, some observers are out of town for periods of time, or maybe they can only report, a week or two of precipitation, but it's still useful. It's still data that we look at. So the more the better, but you can get involved even if you aren't at a location 24/7.
Doug, I really appreciate you coming on to our program today to talk about CocoRa's. Hopefully we can have you back in the studio at some point so we can talk more about it and then talk more about the different types of observations and the tools that observers use.
That would be great, yeah.
So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for joining this edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Coastal water forecast for the south coast. Southeast winds at 10 knots, seas 5 to 6 feet. The north coast, winds will be south to southeast, pretty light at 10 knots with 5-foot seas. Lynn Canal, winds down to 15 knots from the north, seas at about 4 feet. East winds 15 for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, north winds 15 knots. And for the day Wednesday, Clarence Strait, small craft advisories, southeast winds increasing to 25 knots, seas building to 6 feet. Small craft advisories on the south coast, south winds 25 knots. And the north coast, a little bit stronger, south to southeast winds at 30 knots with seas up around 20 feet. Lynn Canal, north at 15, Stevens Passage, northeast at 20 knots. Prince William Sound, southeast winds 20 knots for Tuesday, seas at 4 feet. And the North Gulf Coast, southeast winds 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, southeast at 35 knots. Gale warnings also for Kamishak Bay, east winds 35 knots, and Cook Inlet, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots with 5-foot seas. And for Wednesday, gale warnings for Prince William Sound, east winds 35 knots, seas up to 9 feet. And the eastern North Gulf Coast, gale warnings, south winds 40 knots with 14-foot seas. Southwest 30-knot winds for the western North Gulf Coast. And for the Barren Islands, west winds 40 knots. High-end gales for Kamishak Bay, northwest winds 45 knots, and southern Cook Inlet gale warnings, northwest winds 40 knots with 12-foot seas. North of the Forelands, small craft advisories for 30-knot winds from the north. And for Kodiak Island, east-southeast winds on Tuesday at 25 knots, and variable to south winds at 25 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Bristol Bay, southeast winds 15 knots, seas 5 feet. For Wednesday, 30-knot winds there for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula. Out of the west, and also for Bristol Bay and Shelikof Strait, gale warnings for the east side of Kodiak Island and the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula for west-northwest winds at 35 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, west winds 25 to 30 knots. Central Aleutians, west winds 30 knots. Western Aleutians, west winds 30 knots. And for the day Wednesday, gale warnings for the western Aleutians for 35-knot winds. Gales also for the central Aleutians, south to southeast at 40 to 45 knots. And 30 to 40-knot winds from the south and southwest for the eastern Aleutians. for the southwest coast. South winds 20 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Yukon Delta coast south at 25. Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, south winds 30 knots. Southwest 25 knot winds for St. Matthew Island. And the Pribilofs southwest at 20 knots, sea 7 feet. And for Wednesday, St. Lawrence Island, lighter winds, west at 15 knots, and southwest winds 20 knots for the Yukon Delta coast. Kuskokwim Delta coast, west winds at 30 knots, southwest at 30 for the Pribilofs. St. Matthew Island looking at southwest winds at 25 knots. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, south to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots on Tuesday. South winds 30 knots for the central coast. Gale warnings for the western Arctic coast and the Chukchi Sea for south to southwest winds 40 to 45 knots, seas up to 15 feet. And for Wednesday, Chukchi Sea, west winds 20 to 25 knots. Otherwise, the western Arctic coast winds will be southwest at 30 knots. Small craft advisories continue for the central Arctic coast. South winds 25 knots, seas at 12 feet. And the eastern Beaufort Sea coast winds will be south to southeast at about 20 knots. And for tonight's weather, again, winter storm warnings continue for the Yukon Delta, Seward Peninsula, Kobuk Valley, and Noatak Valley, as well as the northwest coast, Kotzebue, Selawik Valley areas, and the western Arctic coast under a high surf advisory. And otherwise, snow and blowing snow pushes into the central Brooks Range, mostly on the south side for the heaviest snow, not much making it on the north side there in the east. And some snow moving into south central Alaska continues to increase in areas with rain and snow down towards southern Cook Inlet and the North Gulf Coast. And it stays wet and windy over the Aleutians, southern Bering Sea through tomorrow. A little bit of improvement for the Aleutians. Snow and blowing snow up over the northwest part of the state with that low now in the Chukchi Sea. Areas of snow over the western interior. Light snow or snow showers scattered around the east side. Periods of rain and snow on the North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, periods of rain, more clouds, warmer temperatures, and a chance of moisture there for the Panhandle. And then look for those winds to increase with rain and snow for the southeast coast in the afternoon.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.